In December 1943, after successful but costly operations in the Gilbert Islands, especially on the Tarawa Atoll, the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet, under the command of Admiral Chester Nimitz, turned its attention to the next objective: the Marshall Islands. Because of its strategic importance, recognized by the U.S. Navy even before the war, in their hypothetical analysis of potential conflict with Japan, Nimitz even considered the Marshall Archipelago a possible first target of the Central Pacific Island hopping campaign. However, the Navy decided to invade the Gilbert Islands first, to protect the southern flank of the Central Pacific advance. Situated almost in the center of the Western Pacific, the Marshall Islands sits on the supply routes from Hawaii to New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The archipelago was under Japanese control from 1920. So the Navy planners anticipated much heavier defense than one on the Gilbert Islands. Moreover, the relatively close proximity of the main Japanese base in the Central Pacific, located on Truk Island, presented a potential danger for the attacking force. For that reason, the Navy assigned almost the entire Pacific Fleet for the upcoming operation. Task Force 51, responsible for Marshall Island operation, consisted of 11 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 12 cruisers, 75 destroyers, and many more transport and supply ships. The fast carrier force, with 12 more carriers, 8 battleships, 6 cruisers and 32 destroyers, provided the additional support. The Marshall Islands chain consists of 5 islands, 29 atolls, and many more reefs, split into 2 main parts, Ratak on the east, and Ralik on the west. Japanese had bases on 6 atolls, and garrisons on many more islands. Altogether, there were 28,000 Japanese troops under Admiral Masashi Kobayashi, dispersed through the entire Marshall Islands. According to an island hopping strategy, adopted by the U.S. Navy for a campaign in the Central Pacific, only a handful of selected islands would be the target of an amphibious attack. As the Navy didn't want to spend resources and lives trying to take every occupied island. The objective was to take strategically dominant islands within the archipelago, large enough to build an airbase. The bypassed islands, still under Japanese control, would then be the target of airstrikes, and their supply lines would be cut off by a naval and air blockade. Without supplies, food, and ammunition, by the end of the war, the Japanese-controlled islands would have been neutralized to the point that they would serve as targets for the training of the new bomber crews. After careful planning, for an operation in the Marshall Islands, the Navy decided to take Eniwetok Atoll, located on the northwest corner of the archipelago, Kwajalein, the main Japanese base in the center of the archipelago, and Majuro Atoll in the south. For the amphibious landings and land operations, the Navy assigned the newly formed 4th Marine Division, under the command of Major General Harry Schmidt, the 7th Infantry Division, under Major General Charles Corlett, and a separate 22nd Marine Regiment, under Brigadier General Thomas Watson. By the end of 1943, everything was ready for the operation, codenamed Flintlock. Experiences from the landing on Tarawa, which led to the high loss of lives, forced the Navy planners to revise the plan during December. Lessons from Tarawa have shown that the use of the landing vehicle tracked, LVT, on a larger scale is necessary for the success of the landing operation. The LVTs offered better protection for the troops, and could easily cross the coral reefs in front of the islands. In addition, during the Battle of Tarawa, the heavy warships were too close to the shore, and the resultant low trajectory caused many shells to simply bounce off the island, and land in the sea, leaving many pillboxes, bunkers and emplacements undamaged. Lessons learned on Tarawa were included in a revised plan designated as Flintlock II. The Flintlock was a complex operation, divided into several phases. The main phase was the seizure of Kwajalein and Majuro, set for the period between January 28 and February 8. The later phases of Operation Flintlock, an amphibious assault on Eniwetok, was essentially a completely separate operation, codenamed Catchpole. According to the plan, the assault on Kwajalein Atoll would move in stages. Kwajalein, the world's largest coral atoll, more than 106 kilometers in length, and 32 kilometers wide, had two main objectives: the conjoined Roi and Namur Islands on the north corner, and Kwajalein Island, on the southern end of the atoll. Before the main landing on these two islands, in the first phase of the plan, small islets near Roi-Namur and Kwajalein would be cleared for artillery deployment. The second phase was the landing on the main objective, while cleaning the atoll's remaining islets was the final stage. The landing on the Roi and Namur Islands was the task of the 4th Marine Division. The islands were connected by a sandspit along the lagoon's side, and the concrete road. The 1st and 2nd Battalion of the 23rd Marine would land on Roi from the lagoon's side, on two beaches codenamed from west to east, as Red 2 and Red 3. Landing on Namur was the task of the 3rd and 2nd Battalion, 24th Marine, who would land on Green 1 and Green 2 beach. Attack on both islands was to begin simultaneously. Armor support was the task of the 4th Light Tank Battalion. The companies of the 25th Marine would clear lightly defended, small islands on the western and eastern sides of the Roi-Namur, before the main attack, for the deployment of the 4th Marine Division artillery, for close artillery support. Approximately 3,000 Japanese troops were defending Roi-Namur and the surrounding islands. Besides the garrison, the island defenses consisted of two batteries of twin-mounted 127mm guns, and many more anti-aircraft cannons and heavy machine guns. The line of pillboxes, trenches, and anti-tank ditches surrounded the island, positioned right on the beach. Kwajalein Island was the objective of the 7th Infantry Division, and just as on Roi-Namur, before the main invasion, the 7th Reconnaissance Troop would take nearby islands for the artillery positions. The main assault would commence from the west, with the 184th Infantry Regiment landing on the northern beach, designated as Red 1, and the 32nd Infantry Regiment would land on the southern, Red 2 beach. The two companies of the 767th Tank Battalion would provide armor support. For the Japanese High Command, the Marshall Islands were expendable. Knowing too well that efficient defense of the archipelago is impossible, the garrisons on the islands had only one task: to inflict as much damage to the attacking force as possible. The small and low islands provided little opportunity for the defenders to establish an effective defensive line. There was no space for defense in depth. The only natural obstacle was the coral reef, surrounding all the islands within the atoll. Therefore, Japanese troops had no other option but to protect the coastline. Of the heavy weapons, Kwajalein had twin 127mm guns on each end, a few 80 and 70mm dual-purpose guns, plus many more heavy and light anti-aircraft machine guns. The garrison, under Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama, numbered approximately 5,000 men. The defenders knew too well what awaited them, as they had been subjected to air bombardment since early December, by the carrier and land-based aircraft. The air attacks continued through January, from the newly formed bases in Gilbert Islands. As a result of the air offensive, there was no operational Japanese aircraft in the Marshall area by the beginning of Operation Flintlock. In the pre-dawn hours of January 31st, a large fleet approached Kwajalein Atoll. Shortly after, the first LVTs with men of the 25th Marine headed towards small islets in front of Roi-Namur. A handful of scattered defenders did not put a serious resistance. Within minutes after landing, the men of the 25th Marine secured all the islets. With these islets cleared, the 14th Marine Artillery deployed its howitzers to support the main invasion, scheduled for the following morning. Throughout the night, 3 U.S. Navy battleships, 5 cruisers and 21 destroyers fired shell after shell at the Roi-Namur. The carrier-based planes from 3 escort carriers provided close air support. With the first daylight of February 1st, the 14th Marines Artillery, on the adjacent islands, joined the shelling. At the same time, the Marines of the 23rd and 24th Marine began with final preparations for landing. Not everything went smoothly. The 23rd Marines boarded the LVTs without significant problems. The boarding of the 24 Marines passed in disorder. Despite the initial setback, by the noon of February 1st, all assaulting battalions successfully stormed the beaches of Roi and Namur. On the flat and clear Roi Island, the Marines of the 23rd Marine faced only the sporadic and limited resistance. The advance inland went smoothly. The tanks of the 4th Tank Battalion, and the LVTs, fired fiercely over the open ground, on everything that moved. With the support of the tanks, the Marines quickly reached the first target, Objective 1 line, which runs across the island from west to east, approximately 200 meters inland, with the eastern end on the runway. The progress was so fast, that some units advanced beyond the O1 line, exposing them to potential friendly fire. The tanks wandered all over the northern half of the island. It took some time for Colonel Louis Jones, commander of 23rd Marines, to take control of his troops, and organize them for the final push. At 3:30 p.m., after the 20 minutes long barrage, a final assault on the Roi northern end began. After clearing remaining pillboxes, and pockets of resistance, by 6 p.m., Marines had secured Roi Island. Unlike Roi, flat and open to accommodate the airfield, Namur was covered with dense wood. Following the fierce naval bombardment, heaps of palm fronds, splintered trunks, and other debris, meshed with the undergrowth to shroud the island's buildings, bunkers, and pillboxes from view. As a result, the Marines advanced with caution. Sometimes, a lone defender would halt the entire platoon. The wreckage of destroyed buildings and dense bush caused organizational problems. The companies became mixed up, and in some parts, gaps between the units appeared. The supporting tanks encountered a deep and undamaged anti-tank ditch that prevented them from moving from the beach. As the Marines moved more inland, a resistance grew stiffer. In the early afternoon, a catastrophic event occurred. On the right flank, the men of the 2nd Battalion fought their way to O1 line, when they came across a large concrete structure that looked abandoned. However, Marines feared that any attempt to bypass it would result in a flanking counterattack. The men of Company F approached from the left, while the group from Company E closed in from the right. Soon they were joined by the demolitions team. The sappers moved in, and threw satchel charges into the hole. What happened next was incomprehensible. A massive explosion obliterated the structure. A pile of smoke and dust rose more than 300 meters. The debris rained down over the island. A shocked aerial observer reported, "The whole damned island has blown up." Without knowing, the Marines blew up an ammunition storage facility that housed 100 or more torpedo warheads. The catastrophic explosion left a 30 meters water-filled crater. 20 Marines lost their lives, while 100 were wounded. The magnitude of the explosion raised confusion among the Marines. The attack on the right had lost momentum. At the same time, The event had raised the morale of the defenders. Suddenly, the entire front came alive. What had once been a steady drive, against fragmented and poorly organized defenders, from then, disintegrated into a crawl. The tempo of the advance slowed, and then eventually, ground to a halt. With the nightfall, Colonel Franklin Hart, commanding officer of the 24th Marines, decided to cease offensive operations, and ordered his troops to dig in for the night. No one slept on the Roi-Namur Island. During the night, Marines repelled several small banzai charges. Reinforced with elements of the 23rd Marines, and a few tanks arrived from Roi during the night. At 9 a.m., Marines resumed the attack. By 12:15 p.m., the Marines reached the northern end of Namur. It took the Marines 2 more hours to clear the isolated pockets of resistance. At 2:18 p.m., Colonel Hart declared the island as secured. In its first combat action, the 4th Marine Division performed well. The Marines suffered 1,018 casualties in taking both islands, of whom 206 died. Of the 3,563 defenders, only 92 were taken prisoner, more than half were Korean laborers. Meanwhile, on February 1, men of the 7th Reconnaissance Troop, the 7th Infantry Division, carried out the first landings on the islets near Kwajalein Island. Small groups of Japanese soldiers put only limited resistance. The action on islets went smoothly. Supported by 4 battleships, 3 cruisers, 18 destroyers, and planes from 3 escort carriers, the 7th Reconnaissance Troop quickly completed all objectives, suffering only 1 man wounded. Shortly after, the divisional artillery landed its 4 battalions of 155 and 105 mm howitzers. 4 battleships, 3 cruisers, 18 destroyers, and planes from 3 escort carriers provided support for the main landing on Kwajalein, set for 9:30 a.m. the same day. The power of the pre-assault barrage was unprecedented in the Pacific, as more than 36,000 rounds of naval gunfire landed on the island. Throughout the day, and a whole night, warships and howitzers bombed the enemy positions on Kwajalein. The first waves of infantry landed on the Red 1 and Red 2 beach without any problems, as the artillery fire obliterated Japanese defense on the landing beaches. Debris, craters and stumps presented a bigger problem than an enemy fire during the initial landing. The bulldozers were called upon, and landed shortly after the first waves. Despite the sporadic enemy fire, they began to clear the path for the tanks and LVTs piled up on the landing beach. The Americans advanced, slow but steady, as every survived pillbox, shelter or trench had to be carefully cleared. By night, men of the 7th Infantry Division advanced approximately 1 kilometer inland. The men of the 32nd Regiment moved roughly 250 meters eastward, more than 184th, creating the gap along the runway between 2 regiments. Throughout the night, surviving Japanese troops unsuccessfully tried to use the gap to infiltrate the rear of the American positions. The Americans, who expected a new Tarawa, were surprised with the light defense, and relatively light casualties suffered. Both regiments lost 21 men killed and 87 wounded. The following day, companies of the 32nd and 184th Regiments, supported with the tanks of 767th Tank Battalion, continued with the advance, facing surprisingly light resistance. At the end of the second day, Americans had already under control half of the island, suffering 11 dead and 241 wounded. On February 3, after artillery preparation, the Americans resumed the attack. Soon, they reached the large building complex, known as the Admiralty Area, where they encountered strong Japanese resistance groups, hidden in ruins. The whole day, the fighting raged in the built-up area. Slowly, clearing one strong point after another, men of the 7th Infantry Division moved forward, advancing further inland by another kilometer, suffering the heaviest casualties so far: 54 dead and 255 wounded. After 3 days of fighting, Americans had 2/3 of the island in their possession. During the night, the Japanese launched several banzai attacks. On February 4, everything was ready for the final push. The attack began at 7:15 a.m., and forward troops immediately ran into stiff resistance. After an almost entire day of fighting, men of the 7th Infantry Division reached the northern end of Kwajalein by 4:10 p.m. Cleaning of isolated pockets of resistance lasted until 7:20 p.m., when the island was finally in American hands. During the 4 days of fighting, the 7th Infantry Division suffered 989 casualties, of whom 142 died. Of approximately 5,000 Japanese troops, 166 surrendered. Implementing lessons learned from Tarawa, the Navy significantly reduced the number of casualties. The enhanced use of LVTs successfully neutralized the first Japanese line of defense, the coral reef in front of the islands. The effectiveness of naval gunfire had improved dramatically since Tarawa. The combination of naval and land artillery, with air attacks, killed 50 to 75% of Japanese defenders on Kwajalein Atoll. However, after completing operations on Kwajalein Atoll, the Navy still had work to do on the Marshall Islands. The abandoned Majuro was captured by American troops on the 31st of January 1944, without casualties. The time has come for the execution of the Operation Catchpole, the landing on Eniwetok Atoll.